this particular event, which is a non-dancing dance event, to order. So I'll request that you mute all, and we'll have some time for Q&A and for socializing later on. But for now, on with the show. This is CDNY Country Dance Lore, and tonight's talk is by Tom Amesse. Tom did a program in the fall, bringing us a lot of news from the 17th and early 18th centuries, and some connections to English country dance names. And he's going to continue on that topic tonight. Just a little review of our format. After these announcements, we'll start the presentation in just a couple of minutes. It'll be about a half hour, 35 minutes at 8:10, 8:15. We'll do the Q&A portion of it, which will be questions put into the chat box and that Helen will ask, or Jeff will ask of Tom. And then we will go off Facebook and just do the socializing part of the evening. So right now we are recording. We're on Facebook, we're live streaming, and this will be recorded for posterity. And you can see it either on Facebook or YouTube. And we have this link on our cdny.org website, the lore page. It's also on the reminders that you get. If you want to see a collection of all the YouTubes we've done in the lore series, they're all in one spot. If you wish, you can turn off the video and you won't be live streamed and recorded. You can also stop the video to just improve your connection. Sometimes stuttering happens. We ask you to remain muted during the presentation. We do want your questions. Please type them into the chat box and we will pitch them to Tom a little later on. CDNY does have other virtual events. We have a couple of series. Thursday, wow, February 125th, or just maybe February 25th. Next Thursday night at 7:30, Cynthia Shaw is leading another CDNY live event. That one is gonna, it's live music and hijinks. Then the following Thursday, also at 7:30 p.m., is our Country Dance Lore, and that'll be with Margaret and Chip. And so next time on Country Dance Lore, it is dances choreographed to tunes by Purcell. Henry Purcell composed music for the London stage and has posthumously collaborated with many choreographers to produce English country dances that we enjoy today. So come and hear them talk and play music that is by Purcell, and hear about some great moments in Purcell's English country dances. Other announcements. If you would like to send me feedback, I certainly do want to receive it. You can send it to me at englishprogram@cdny.org or my personal email address. If desired, you can make a donation to CDNY at cdny.org/give. Tonight's team, I am Dorothy Cummings talking at you. Jeff Berry is running the Zoom controls and he's live streaming us to Facebook. Thank you, Jeff. Helen White is running the door and she's collecting your questions from the chat box. Jeff is collecting any questions that accumulate on Zoom. So without further ado, I want to reintroduce your friend and mine, Tom Amesse, caller extraordinaire, and history buff, who has given us some interesting and cool stuff about English history in the past and English history related to English country dance. So this is the Jack's Health News Hour, Part 2. Tom, please take it away. Looking forward to this.
Thank you very much. I believe I'm unmuted, is that correct? Let me see if I can show the, okay, I'm not seeing myself, but that's okay.
You are unmuted.
I'm muted?
No, you are unmuted.
I'm unmuted already. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you, Dorothy. You've been terrific in putting a lot of work together and getting this whole series. It's been wonderful, and thank you for doing all the work. And thanks to CDNY for sponsoring this. It's very much appreciated. I want to thank the crew, Helen and Jeff, tonight for the work, and I want to thank Susan Amesse for listening to this presentation once or twice. Anyway, I said last time I'm not an historian, but although I'm not, I really love to read history. I've been doing that for a very long time. And tonight's news hour is not a dance lesson. It's a look at a piece of history behind the dancing. And I've been dancing since the mid-90s, as I've said before, and one of the first teachers I came into contact with was Beverly Francis. Happy birthday, Beverly. Beverly called a dance called Jack's Maggot, and she was very good at describing what a maggot is, but I wanted to know who Jack was. And last time I went into the fact that there were about 20 dances with the name Jack in them, many of them referring probably or likely to the Jacobites. But Beverly herself asked me a question about a different Jack and whether any of them referred to John Churchill. And I didn't know at the time, and so we're going to tonight discuss a different Jack. First slide, please. So this is not Jack. We all know this as Winston Churchill, the 20th century UK Prime Minister. He is 10 generations removed from his likely most well-known ancestor named John Churchill, who was the first Duke of Marlborough. Winston wrote about him in a series of books called Marlborough, His Life and Times during the 1930s. And much of Churchill's World War II rhetoric and thought can be found in these books. Next slide. This is also Winston Churchill, but it's the Winston Churchill of the 17th century. This was the father of John Churchill. This Winston was the son of a West Country lawyer who was at law school when the English Civil Wars broke out in 1642. He left law school to fight on the side of the Royalists. He and his father were very staunch Royalists. And that didn't go so well. The Royalists were defeated, and Winston was forced to pay a fine of about £400. And if you equivalent to today's money, it comes to about £45,000. So he paid his fine, and he and his wife were broke, and they moved in with his wife's mother. And his wife's mother happened to be a very staunch parliamentarian. So John was born into this household. John was born in 1650 at his grandmother's house, and he grew up in a household where his father was a royalist, his mother's mother was a parliamentarian, and he learned a lot of diplomacy at the dinner table almost every night. When the Stuarts were restored to the throne in 1660, Charles II owed Winston. So he allowed Winston to put his children, he had 4 at the time, to the court. So at about age 15 in 1665, John Churchill became a page of honor to the Duke of York. And the Duke of York was Charles II's brother James, and he later becomes James II. So the next slide. This is Duke of Marlborough as a young man, a little older than when he was a page. So in 1667, Marlborough, John Churchill at the time, we'll be referring to him as Marlborough, but he was not the Duke of Marlborough until 1704. I'll get to that later. But in 1667, he was appointed as an ensign in the infantry, and that's not such a big deal. It's just an entry-level ensignship. However, he was given the title ensign in the King's Own Company, which is the best ensign position in the entire infantry. Now, John had an older sister, Arabella, who was also at court. And Arabella became a mistress to the Duke of York, and she bore him some children, the first one in 1667. So it's very likely that she pushed his career along a bit. This is a painting of James as the Duke of York. So John, while he was in the military, he gained a lot of experience, both militarily and diplomatically, during the 1670s and 80s. He was cited for courage in the Anglo-Dutch Wars. Now, the Anglo-Dutch Wars happened when Charles became the king, and it was the war where the Dutch lost New Amsterdam to the British, and we now know that as New York. John didn't fight in the New World. He fought mostly in the Low Countries. And when the Anglo-Dutch War was over, he was left in charge of an English cavalry troop under French command for the Franco-Dutch War, which was the next war that came along. And there was a Marshal Turenne of France who once wrote that Marlborough learned to speak and write bad French with fluency and confidence. Next slide, please. This is a painting of the Duke of York, James, with his family. This is Anne Hyde, his first wife, and the two young girls on the left you'll see in the blue dress. This is Mary, who goes on to become Mary II of England, and between Anne and James, there's little Anne. She goes on to become Queen Anne of England. When she was a princess, about the age you see her now, she was sent to Paris for treatment of an eye condition. She lived there for about a year or so. First, she was given to the custody of her grandmother, and shortly after she moved in there, her grandmother died suddenly. Then she was moved to an aunt's home. Her aunt then died suddenly when she moved in there. After the treatments were done, she moved back to England, to London, and her mother suddenly died of breast cancer. So she began to lose all of these older women in her life. Next painting, please. Okay. This is just a close-up of the two. The next one, please. These are, on your left, Queen Anne later in life, when she became the queen. And to the right is Sarah Churchill, Sarah Jennings at the time. Sarah Jennings was one of the young women at court. She was about 5 years older than Anne. And Anne was a very quiet, very reserved, very awkward child, nothing like her older sister Mary, who was outgoing. And Sarah often took Anne under her wing when Anne was left behind in things, and Sarah showed her a lot of attention. And Anne, as a result, became very faithfully devoted to her. In 1678, Sarah married John Churchill. Next slide. This is Queen Anne when she was still a princess, and her husband, Prince George of Denmark. They married in 1683. He was a very good and a very devoted husband to his wife. And Sarah had become, by this time, very close to Anne and Anne's major confidant. And one of the major things that George of Denmark did was he pretty much went along with whatever Sarah suggested for Anne. Now, during their marriage, Anne actually had 17 pregnancies. Most of them ended in miscarriages or stillbirths. Others died from childhood diseases, and only one child lived beyond more than a couple of years. This was Prince William of Gloucester, and he died sadly at age 11. Back to Jack. Next slide. This is a painting of Marlborough in one of the paintings in his prime. In 1685, Charles II died without any legitimate heirs. His younger brother, James, happened to be openly Catholic. He ascended to the throne, but this did not bode well with a lot of folks. So Charles, although he didn't have legitimate heirs, he had several illegitimate heirs, and one of them, James Scott, was the Duke of Monmouth. He happened to be Protestant, and he felt that he deserved to be the king, not James. So Monmouth led a revolt against James. Monmouth, and it was called the Monmouth Rebellion, and it was also known as the Pitchfork Rebellion. It consisted mostly of West Country farmers who attacked London with pitchforks. But John Churchill was very instrumental in overthrowing the rebellion, and it really strengthened his place with James II. Next painting, please. This is the Duke of Monmouth, James Scott. When he was overthrown by Churchill, he was sent to the Tower and he was subsequently executed. But now with the victory over the rebels, James now becomes very overconfident. He begins purging Protestants everywhere and appointing Catholics both militarily and politically. He alienated everyone who helped him overthrow Monmouth. So next slide. In 1688, on your left you see William of Orange. On the right is Mary I. Mary, who was James' daughter, married William of Orange, her cousin. So this is James' nephew and son-in-law. The immortal seven members of Parliament were invited William to come to England, not to invade, but to overthrow James. So William lands in England, and the Duke of John Churchill at the time was one of the first to defect from James' army and go to the side of William. And William, then was not actually, it wasn't sure that William was going to be the King of England at the time, because James left England and it was Mary that was James's heir, not William. So even if they decided to be co-rulers, if Mary died before William, the crown would go to Anne as next in line. So Sarah Churchill at the time, comes to the rescue, and she convinces Anne to give up her rights to the throne as long as William is alive. So this again strengthens Marlborough in the court, but this time the court of William. So William promotes him to the rank of lieutenant general, and he starts work on reorganizing the English army. So over the next several years, Churchill falls in and out of favor with William. And primarily at first, in 1692, Churchill approached James II in exile and asked James for a pardon for the role that he took in overthrowing James. William finds out about this and he's angered by it. And James is only off the throne a few years, so the Jacobites are very much active right now trying to get James reinstated over William. And Churchill is implicated, as it turns out falsely, in many conspiracy theories, not only to usurp William, but to assassinate him. So as a result of this, William puts John Churchill into the Tower of London as a prisoner for several months during the year 1694. Now, if you think about it, Marlborough was acting the politician at the time. He knew about Charles I having been beheaded. He knew about Cromwell and the interim, the protectorate. He knew Cromwell's son was overthrown. He knew that Monmouth tried to overthrow James, and finally William did. So it wasn't absolutely sure that William was going to retain the throne. It was possible that James would become the king again, and Marlborough wanted to have his place at court, regardless of who was there. Meanwhile, in Spain, next slide. The Habsburgs of Austria had married into the Spanish royal family in the early 16th century. They ruled Spain for close to 200 years. Now, this is the family tree of the King of Spain in the late 1600s, Charles II. You can see that the red asterisks show first cousin marriages. And worse than that, the solid red lines show uncle and niece marriages. So Charles II was the result of generations of inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburgs literally bred themselves out of existence. And the irony, of course, is that the family married within their own ranks in order to maintain the power and control. So next slide shows a portrait of Charles II. You could clearly show the physical deformities. The protruding chin was a Habsburg trait, but his protruded so much he couldn't chew his food. He had a drooping lower lip, caused him to dribble all the time. And it also shows the challenge that the court painters would have faced in painting his portrait. he was unable to produce any offspring, and he was effectively the end of the dynasty. So the question was, who would succeed him on the throne when he died? Now, next slide. So there were several failed attempts at negotiations by England and France to have a suitable heir to the Spanish throne. This map of Europe shows France right in the middle there, and England, and both of them wanted someone that they could depend on not to upset the balance of power. There were many different negotiations, but they all failed. And in 1698, Charles II of Spain was convinced that only the Bourbons, that was the family of Louis XIV of France, could keep the Spanish Empire together. Now, the Spanish Empire is not only Spain right here. You can see what a large empire France and Spain together would have been within Europe, but Spain had a lot of other places under control, most of South America, Central America, parts of North America. There were even a lot of holdings in the Pacific, so it would have made France extremely powerful. But Charles II named Philip of Anjou, who was the grandson of Louis XIV of France, as the next Spanish monarch. So the next slide shows Charles had died in 1700, and this is a slide, this is a painting of Louis XIV coronating his grandson, Philip of Anjou, as the King of Spain. And so began the War of Spanish Succession. Back to Marlborough. The War of Spanish Succession, next slide, please. The War of Spanish Succession involved basically France and a few small entities against what they call the Grand Alliance, which was England, the Dutch, and the Holy Roman Empire, and a few other small entities. So by 1700, Marlborough was back in favor with William, but William's health was failing at this point. William would have led the army himself. He had done that often in the late 1600s, but he couldn't do it. So he appointed Marlborough not only ambassador to the Grand Alliance, but commander of the English forces. And in effect, he was commander of all of the forces. Now, Mary had died in 1694. William died in 1702, right after the war started. They were childless, so Mary's sister, Anne, ascended to the throne, and Anne's relationship with Sarah Churchill continued when Anne was queen. So again, it strengthened Marlborough's position, and Anne retained him in overall command of the army. During the 17th century, the prior 100 years, a little bit about military history at the time, very brief. Military tactics moved toward defensive methods. Offensive actions received very little recognition, and in order to be considered an effective commander, it was less important to actually win than it was to guard against defeat. So as a result, cities and towns throughout Europe became more and more fortified at this time. Siege warfare became the norm. So the pitched battle was very expensive, both monetarily and in terms of casualties, but sieges took time. Now, Marlborough was very innovative in devising tactics to take advantage of the advances in current military technology. So a little bit about memorable events. They spur things like songs, poems, dances to commemorate them, and the War of Spanish Succession was no different. It allowed for a lot of topical references. Marlborough himself fought mostly in the Low Countries and then in Bavaria around Munich, but there were a lot of battles elsewhere, and some of the dances that we know that have these names of other battles: Barcelona, Burgundy's Flight, Almenara, General Stanhope's March, the Spanish Flight, Widows Shall All Have Husbands, and of course the Duke of Marlborough's March, which appeared in Young in 1710. But there were other things besides dances and songs that were made to commemorate things. So the next slide here, it shows a coin that was minted in 1703 to commemorate a naval battle in Vigo. The British Navy went to Cadiz to challenge the Spanish fleet, and that didn't work out so well. But on their way back, they noticed French escorts to Spanish treasure ships in the Bay of Vigo. So they attacked them. They destroyed some of the ships. They captured some of them. They brought the treasure back to England, and it was a great naval victory. So there is a dance named Vigo. It's in Andrew Shaw's Emperor of the Moon. But this sixpence was also minted to commemorate the battle. Next slide, please. This is a facsimile of a dance called the Royal Navy from 1702. Now, Henry Playford, most of us know who he is, the son of John Playford, publisher of all of the dances we know from that era, the 1650s to the 1720s. But he was also a publisher of other things. He wanted to make money. In 1702, when the war was just starting, people were clamoring for information. So he published, in addition to this dance, he published a pamphlet entitled A List of the Royal Navy in England in 1702. And it listed the ships, it gave details, for example, where they were built, the tonnage, how many guns they had. And in 1703, a year later, he reissued that pamphlet with an addendum that gave a list of the French and Spanish galleons that were destroyed at Vigo. Marlborough was the de facto leader of the Allied forces, and he ensured his place in history as a great general. Some of the battles that he won, again, that dances were written to commemorate, and these are ones that Marlborough was involved in. Ramillies in 1706, Oudenarde in 1708, Malplaquet 1709, Lille 1710. But his greatest victory and his most well-known was in 1704 at a town called Blenheim. Next slide. So the next slide will show this is an etching of the Battle of what became known as Blenheim. It was a mispronunciation of Blenheim, a little town outside of Munich. Now, it's important to note that there were little entities here and there in Europe. Some of them were part of the Holy Roman Empire. Some of them had broken away and became independent. But there was a Duchy of Savoy. It was on the border of what we now know as Italy and France, kind of southwest of Switzerland. And they went in on the side of France because the northern part of what we know as Italy right now was under the control of Spain, and Savoy wanted to expand into Milan. So they went in on the side of France and thinking that the French army is the best, they're going to win. We want to be on their side so we can have some of the spoils of war. Well, after a year or two of negotiations and fighting on the side of France, France was unable to give them any promises that they would give them any territory. So they left that side and they went over to the side of the Grand Alliance. And it was kind of fortuitous because the military leader of the forces of Savoy was a Prince Eugene. Now, the slide you're looking at is the Battle of Blenheim, one of Marlborough's great victories. The next slide shows you, this is Eugene of Savoy. So during the battle, Marlborough continually attacked the center of the French lines, but they continually attempted to outflank him. And Eugene was very instrumental in guarding Marlborough's flank, as well as sending him reinforcements to the battle, so he was able to be victorious. The Battle of Blenheim, which was in August 13th of 1704, was an extremely important battle, not only for Marlborough, but for the Grand Alliance. It was the first major defeat of the French army in over 50 years. It saved Vienna from the French army. It preserved the fractious alliance between Austria, England, and the United Provinces against France. It knocked Bavaria out of the war. That was one of the smaller entities that was fighting on the side of France. and it exemplified a near-perfect cooperation between Marlborough and Eugene that carried on for another 6 years. So the next slide, please, is after the battle, Marlborough writes a dispatch to his wife, not to the Queen, to his wife, telling his wife to tell the Queen of the great victory they had at Blenheim. And we know of a couple of dances. One's called Woodstock Park, and another one, Blenheim House. Next slide. This is a map of a place called Woodstock Park. It's northwest of London, near Stratford-upon-Avon. It was defined as the King's Enclosure, where beasts of the chase and exotic animals were kept. It was created circa 1100 as a royal deer park. It remained so until about 1705, when it was granted to John Churchill. It had quite an uneventful history until 1554, when Queen Mary briefly imprisoned her sister, Elizabeth I, in a hunting lodge on the site. And about 100 years after that, during the English Civil Wars, it was damaged. The hunting lodge was damaged by Cromwell's troops. And as a result of Marlborough's victory, Queen Anne gifted the land and the funds to build a residence for her friend, Sarah, and her friend's husband, who won the battle. And at this time, he was made the first Duke of Marlborough, and she the Duchess of Marlborough. Next slide, please. This is an engraving of Blenheim Palace, circa 1800. And the architect hired to build the palace was Sir John Vanbrugh. He was an early conservationist. He wanted to take that hunting lodge that was destroyed by Cromwell, where Elizabeth was kept, and restore it and make it part of the landscape. But Sarah Churchill would have none of it, and she had the remains swept away. Next slide. This is a panorama of Blenheim House in modern time, Blenheim Palace in modern times. And we know the dance is Blenheim House, but the residence is known as Blenheim Palace. It's the only non-royal, non-episcopal residence in the UK named Palace. And the reason is Anne gifted this to John Churchill. So as a thank you to Anne, he promised to address the residence palace as a monument to Queen Anne. So it's known as Blenheim Palace, but we know the dance is Blenheim House. A couple of little interesting asides here. Winston Churchill, the 20th century one, was born here in 1874. Some famous films that were partially shot on the site were Young Winston, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Black Beauty. Next slide, please. And this tree on the grounds of Blenheim Palace appeared in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. I think Malfoy jumped from it, if I'm not mistaken. Next slide. Sarah Churchill, the first Duchess of Marlborough, was the title character in the 2018 film, The Favourite. Next slide. This shows the characters in The Favourite, Queen Anne, Sarah Churchill, and Abigail Masham, and the three actresses that portrayed them. And there's a satirical ballad. 1708 seemed to be kind of a turning point in the relationship of Queen Anne and Sarah. There's a satirical ballad entitled The She Favourite. It depicts the relationship, or the alleged relationship, that Sarah and Anne had. The She Favourite comes up in modern times. Next slide. Book of Dances that we know of, that Andrew Shaw published. But in 1707-08, Abigail Masham's influence over Anne, and Abigail was Sarah's cousin, Abigail's influence began to eclipse Sarah's. Abigail's personality was much more similar to Anne. She was quiet, she was reserved, and she was respectful to Anne. She seemed to be a much more suitable companion. And in 1708, there was a pamphlet published which seemed to be in retaliation to that ballad, and it was entitled The Rival Duchess, or The Court Incendiary, and it attacked Abigail's character. Uh, the author of that was very likely Arthur Mainwaring, who happened to work for Sarah Churchill. Next slide. Sarah did have a very powerful position in the household. She was the keeper of the privy purse. You'll notice there's a key under her right elbow. She wore that around her waist as a symbol of her authority. She managed the finances of the royal household, not the country, but it was a very powerful position within the household. But her overfamiliarity became very unacceptable and disrespectful. For example, there's a couple of documented instances. Anne's husband, the Prince of Denmark, George, he died in 1708, and Sarah cruelly mocked Anne for being depressed about her husband's death. And at another point in 1708, they arrived at St. Paul's Cathedral and they emerged from a carriage in which they obviously had just had an intense argument. And Sarah turned to the Queen in front of everyone and said, "Be quiet." So Anne had finally had enough of her. And next slide, please. And this is a pencil drawing of Anne showing Sarah the door, kind of like Ralph Cramden. "Get out!" The stormy relationship to the Queen, though, with the Queen, helped Marlborough for many years. But suddenly, and this happened in 1711 here, suddenly Sarah's no longer working for the Queen, and the funds to build Blenheim Palace stopped coming, and Marlborough was forced from office. Toward the end of her life, she wrote in 1742, Sarah published a book entitled An Account of the Conduct of the Dowager Duchess of Marlborough. It sheds light on her relationship with the Queen, but her attempts at self-vindication in this book come across as unforgiving, spiteful, and there were numerous unkind criticisms of Anne, and one wonders whether she ever genuinely cared for Anne at all. By the time she died in 1744, she had fallen out with many of her friends and her family. Next slide. Anne, and this is Olivia Colman portraying Anne next to her. She was queen from 1702 to 1714. She died in that year. She died childless. There are some interesting records about birthday celebration balls during her lifetime. Next slide. This, on the left, you'll see a slide of the Queen's birthday. This was published in 1708, and it was almost certainly written for her. But on the right there, you see the Queen's jig. And this first appeared in 1701, which is a bit unusual. Anne was not yet queen in 1701. And Mary had died in 1694. There was no queen for about a 7-year period. It's likely it was more likely for Mary, and it just hadn't been published until 1701, but there's no definitive answer to that. Next slide. Little interesting aside here. This is an engraving of Mr. Isaac. It appears in the Keller and Scheimer book, along with the dance Mr. Isaac's Maggot. There's some question as to who Mr. Isaac was, and the reason is this. There was a Mr. Isaac Thorpe who died in 1681, but there were many more references after that to a Mr. Isaac. Well, last time I spoke, I mentioned Jerome Francis Gohori, and he taught Charles II to dance when he was in France, and when Charles reascended to the throne in England, Gohori was the one that he hired as the first of many royal dancing masters. There's a royal patent, which is basically a contract dated 1665 that shows Gohori as in this position. And he lived a very interesting, long, and very lucrative life, died a rich man in 1703. But he didn't work alone. His sister was married to Isaac Thorpe, who was the first Mr. Isaac. And their son, whose name was, I'll get them, Francis Thorpe, worked with Gahori. And it's postulated that Francis Thorpe kept his father's name and became known as Mr. Isaac to honor his father as a dancing master who passed away while Francis worked with James Gahori, his uncle. There were references also to in Keller and Scheimer about a Monsieur Lesac from France that could have been confused, but I found a different Monsieur Isaac, so it could have been the same person in handwriting as what it was to the time, cursive, you know what I'm saying. So by 1714, when Anne died, her father, who was James II, he also had already died. So her half-brother, who was James' son from a different marriage, Catherine of Modena, who was Catholic, claimed the throne, but he had been excluded because he was Catholic, and the 1689 Bill of Rights and the 1701 Act of Settlement excluded any Catholics from the throne. So, next slide, please. This is a painting of George I, George of Hanover. He was also Anne was the great-granddaughter of James I. This was the great-grandson of James I through a different line. So he took the throne in 1714. He was crowned. And we know a dance called Joy After Sorrow. And this was written for the coronation, or right around the coronation. It depicted the joy that they felt in finding a king after the sorrow of the death of Queen Anne. And George I was the first one that was coronated or crowned as the King of Great Britain in 1707. The Act of Unity took Scotland and England and made them one country. So we have the next slide. It was Joy After Sorrow. Okay. So with George's ascension to the throne, Marlborough returned to favor. But just 2 years later, Marlborough had a stroke and it effectively ended his career. He died in 1722. Next slide. This is Marlborough. It's a painting that he sat for after his stroke. He was in retirement here. His leadership of the Allied armies fighting Louis XIV from 1701 to 1710 consolidated Britain's emergence as a front-rank power. His diplomatic ability to maintain unity in the coalition was heralded, and he's often remembered by military historians as much for his organizational and logistic skills as his tactical abilities, which is very unusual. Most high-ranking officers don't have very advanced abilities in all three areas like that. He was also instrumental in moving away from siege warfare, and he always argued that one battle is worth 10 sieges. Another painting of Marlborough. Next slide. This is Marlborough Triumphant at the Battle of Blenheim. 100 years later, General Foy, who was a very able general of Napoleon, wrote of Wellington's performance at Salamanca, put him, quote, almost on the level of Marlborough. So Foy thought that Marlborough was even better than Wellington. And Napoleon himself regarded Marlborough's campaigns as a model. He reread them many times. And he once wrote that he put Marlborough at a higher place than Frederick the Great. Another slide. This is a painting of Marlborough being heralded by heaven. So who was Jack? I asked that at the end of the last talk, and I asked that at the end of this talk. That's okay, put the next slide up, that's fine. there were about 20 dances with Jack in the title, and a lot of them probably refer to the Jacobites, but some of them may refer to Marlborough. Jack's health, which I mentioned earlier, was more likely a Jacobite reference. But Jack's maggot, this facsimile of that, was 1703, and it kind of fits the time period where Marlborough began to make his gains in the War of Spanish Succession. There was another one in 1718, after he retired and had his stroke, called Well Done, Jack. I suppose it's possible. The only one I'm absolutely sure of is a modern dance by Jan Dale called Jack by the Hedge. It's about garlic. That's all I have. Thank you very much for listening.
Tom, I think you've outdone yourself. That was really very interesting and lively talk about a really soap opera time. I mean, it's no wonder there's several movies about these people, because they're kind of larger than life and big personalities, and so I don't know about Helen, but I have collected some questions that I want to start you on, if I may. Oh, right. So do you have any juicy tidbits from Sarah Churchill's tell-all?
Actually, I'm sorry, I don't have any.
It sounds like, I mean, I'm just trying to picture, it sounds very tabloid.
It does, and I saw some secondary sources, but it's hard right now to do a lot of in-depth research, and I was unable to do that. Everything I told you was actually about that particular thing was secondhand information.
Okay, well, I have a couple more. There we go. All right, so you were talking about Jack and John and so on. Why, you said you ran across why Jack is a nickname for John. What did you find?
Yeah, that was interesting, because last time someone asked me that and I had no idea. So I looked it up and I found a pamphlet. It's only 35 pages. It was written in 1892 by a gentleman named E.W.B. Nicholson. He was a librarian at the Oxford University. And in this pamphlet, he took great pains to show that Jack had never been used to represent the French Jacques or James. Now, as I mentioned last time, the Jacobites came from the Latin for James, which is Jacobus, or in Latin, Jacobus. And it sounds like Jack should be a nickname for James, but it really isn't. So what he did was he showed that Jack is derived from the Germanic name Johannes, which was shortened to Johann and then shortened again to Jan. Now, Jan, being kind of like Johnny to John, was familiarized by adding the suffix kin. So you would say you would shorten Thomas, for example, to Tom, but then familiarize it by saying Tommy. So Jan was familiarized by saying Jankin. Now the French have a propensity of nasalization and dropping letters, the sound of letters at the end. So Jankin became Yonkin, Yonkin, or Yonkin, and re-anglicizing it, it became Jack. So that was the work of E.W.B. Nicholson, a librarian at Oxford University, as to why Jack is a nickname for John.
Wow, that was a lot of research behind that one. Thanks. Helen, have you collected any questions from our chat box?
People are being very reticent, but do put questions in the chat box if you have them. I have a very minor one, which was the Queen Mary, who was part of William and Mary. Which number did you give her?
She was Queen Mary II.
Okay, good. That's what I thought. I thought I heard you say Queen Mary I, and I thought Mary Tudor was suddenly ousted. So, okay, fine.
No, Mary William Mary was the second. I may have misspoken and said the first, but she was definitely Mary the second.
Okay, fine.
So what about
Hi.
you? Oh, I'm hearing a voice. Oh, you said that a bunch of movies were filmed at Blenheim Palace, Blenheim House. Any other movie tidbits? Because it's the Churchills and the Duke of Marlborough and so forth. They've been filmed many times. What can you tell us about some of the films that as you were looking up this history?
Well, in most of the films that I mentioned, let me just see if I could find the list that I had here. In most of the films that I mentioned, there were just brief exterior shots. It's a very picturesque, panoramic uh, palace, and it was really only used briefly in many of them. It was, to the best of my knowledge, it was mostly used in young Winston because he had been born there and he grew up there, and there were a lot of different moments that were shot there. But the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, there was only one brief um, uh, shot there. The Harry Potter was only the tree. One that I didn't mention, no, I did mention that, the Black Beauty. I didn't see Black Beauty, so I don't know. But it's a picturesque palace. It's a place that is sought after for still shots and films, and that's really everything I know about it.
Do you know who it belongs to at this point?
Yes, it still belongs to the whoever the current Duke of Marlborough is. I don't recall his name, but he's the 11th or 12th, I think. But the Duke of Marlborough, there was a Duke of Marlborough actually that from the 1970s that never actually lived there. But every other Duke of Marlborough for the past 300 and so odd years, that was their residence. It's also open for tours,
Yeah.
and it's nicknamed and not um, it's kind of nicknamed sometimes. People call it the real Downton Abbey, but only because it's a very um, very elegant place that you might want to live. But uh, also Princess Diana Spencer was also related to the Duke of Marlborough's line. Uh, Winston's middle name, I think, Winston's Churchill's middle name was Spencer.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, I'm
that,
just seeing in the chat that James Spencer Churchill is the current Duke. Thanks, Lisa Brown.
thank you,
Oh,
James Spencer Churchill.
so Tom, you said something, remembering Anne and the favorite, the movie, The Favorite, that was a pictorial of, a movie, a dramatization of the relationships between Queen Anne and Sarah Churchill and Abigail, whose last name that, anyhow, there were a bunch of rabbits. Now, did Queen Anne actually keep rabbits? What were the rabbits about?
Good question. If you saw the movie, you'll see that Anne in her bedroom kept a lot of rabbits there, and I don't know whether it was actually ever specifically mentioned or it was mentioned offhand, but the rabbits represented the 17 children or the 17 pregnancies that she had. She actually, in the movie, allegedly named the rabbits after the names of the children that she had. Um, Someone in 1700 or thereabouts, you wouldn't be keeping rabbits as pets. They were mostly looked upon as vermin or as a delicacy in food. So it's very likely that she did not actually keep rabbits. It was kind of an allegory for her children. And if you didn't see the end of the movie, this is a spoiler, so put your hands in your ears for a moment. But when Abigail Masham, Sarah's cousin, became the favorite, at one point Anne was dozing off, and Abigail uh, put her foot down on one of the rabbits and squished it a little bit to kind of tortured a little, and it woke Anne up, and it kind of showed you that she wasn't really there caring about Anne. She was really there because she wanted the money. And Anne took her quickly and had to give her a massage, et cetera, et cetera. But the real relationship between them, well, Anne was 6 years old when she started to look up to Sarah, who was 11. And 11 years old is not that old, but to a 6-year-old, it's an adult. And she looked upon her as an adult her whole life, as her adult, the person that gave her advice. Anne was a very quiet, a very shy person that didn't make a lot of decisions on her own. So Sarah, it got out of hand. And when Abigail, Sarah's cousin, moved in, Sarah, I believe it was Sarah, kind of took pity on her cousin who was on hard times at the time, and she took her in, and Anne seemed to like her better because she was more respectful and more of a good companion for her.
We do have a couple of, if you were finished with that thought, Tom, we do have a couple of questions from the chat. Ellen was asking, she says she's always wondered why the song named Joy After Sorrow sounds so slow, draggy, and sorrowful. So she's wondering if you have a perspective about that.
Well, the only perspective I have is trying to remember how it goes.
Like that.
Okay, so not being an expert in any of this, my perspective is it does sound sorrow. It does sound sorrowful, and it does sound slow, yes. But we don't really know the tempo that they played it at the time either. Now, Joy After Sorrow, I mean, it could represent something like, could represent something like, so we have sorrow that Anne died. But George is here. That's my perspective. I know that it was written in commemoration of George's coronation, but beyond that, it's all a guessing game.
So two other related comments, questions. Jenny Vaughn was remembering the jump rope rhyme, Charlie Chaplin went to France to teach the ladies how to dance. And she says that she does not remember the book that this came from, but it turns out that the source of that was actually Mr. Isaac came from France to teach the people how to dance, which is interesting. And Marty, yeah.
If I could find that reference, I'd like to see that. Thank you.
And Marty wanted to know, and Marty wanted to know if there was anything more known about Mr. Isaac.
There's very little known. I found two dance historians who have done a lot of research on it, and I just really kind of scratched the surface and gave you the information that I gave you, but I only found that actually last week, so I wasn't able to dig as deeply as I would have liked, but I kind of skimmed it, and that's what I found.
But good news for Mr. Isaac enthusiasts, because there will be more information on him when Orly leads her session.
Oh, wonderful.
So come back. And Helen, you said there's one more. We should do one more, and then I think we should break out into the social group and at that point stop the live stream. So that last question.
I don't see any other questions. There was another comment about Blenheim. Marty says that he thinks that the grounds were designed by Capability Brown.
Yes, the grounds, yes. That was back around 1100 when it was first founded as the Royal Deer Park.
Wow. Well, Tom, gosh, we've learned a ton. And I still have questions for you, but I think we should go more casual. Thank you. And let's stop the live stream. And everybody, if you feel like, you just didn't want to be on the live stream, please turn your camera back on now. I invite folks to to chat, ask questions, call it a night, whatever. A week from tonight, there is a CDNY Live. Come enjoy that. 2 weeks from tonight, there is another CDNY Country Dance Lore. And tonight, we'll do a little bit of hanging out. Once again, Tom, thank you. That was terrific. Really, really
Pleasure.
terrific.
Thank you.
Okay. Looks like we're no longer live streaming to Facebook. Okay, so I'm going to ask you some more questions. So Anne, you said that she was sick as a kid. There was something wrong with her eyes.
Yes, it was a minor thing. Her eye was it could have been a type of pink eye, or it could have been something like that. But her eye excessively teared, so she was sent to Paris for medical treatment because apparently the doctors were more trusted by the royalty there. They had spent more time there. And that's when she lived with her grandmother and then her aunt, and they both suddenly died. So I don't know if she had anything to do with their deaths, but
She acquired the nickname Jinxie.
we're gonna have Anne live with you. No!
Actually, the youngest, the son of Abraham Lincoln, believed that he was jinxed because he was present at the assassinations.
Oh, that was Robert Lincoln. He was the only one of Lincoln's sons to live to adulthood, and he was present. He was present at in 1880 at Garfield's assassination, and in 1900 at McKinley's assassination. And
Yeah, he was afraid to go into
Yeah.
someone swearing in because he was
Yeah,
afraid his presence would mean
Yeah,
death.
yeah.
Ah, all right. Did I?
If anyone
No,
would
you
like
already
to
covered the
unmute and say
house
hello.
versus house. I was going to grill you some more, Tom, but I've run out of my own questions.
Oh, that's okay. Really. Alrighty. So
Hi, everyone.
don't
Nice to see you all.
Susan?
Thanks, Tom.
they can hear you?
Okay, not yours. Okay, sorry, we're in the same room.
There, Susan. Anyhow, so this was folks are quiet and they're going off camera, and I think that people are getting tired for the day. But I really enjoyed
you
that.
all to sleep.
No, not at all. No, I don't think that's the issue. I think people are just like filled with the wonders of history.
Thank you.
All the images were great. It was really, really nice to see all those pictures.
Yeah, I was wondering if you knew who any of the artists were. I mean, because those pictures were very impressive.
I know where I got most of them. I could look them up, but I don't have the that information.
It means a lot to be able to see who you're talking about.
Yeah.
Personally, I enjoyed you dishing the dirt.
Watch out for the red lines on the family tree.
Oh, that poor guy.
Oh, gross. That was a lot of red lines and asterisks.
Yeah.
I mean, the family tree is practically recursive.
Yeah.
Dorothy, did I miss the birthday moment?
We would like to wish once again